Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Will, I'm a third year medical student, Mandarin speaker and a language coach. So as some of you may know, I recently conducted an interview with an expert in the science of learning and memory, Benjamin Keep. In that video we discussed what science can tell us about how to structure our language learning and memory retention. One of the key points we touched on was something called the input hypothesis. And in today's video I want to expand on my thoughts about the input hypothesis and tell you where I stand on this hot topic within language learning. First of all, for those of you who haven't heard it before, the input hypothesis refers to an influential set of hypotheses about second language acquisition, first developed by the world-renowned academic linguist Stephen Krashen in the 70s and 80s. In short, Krashen believes that the key to learning a foreign language is what he calls comprehensible input, or CI for short. That means listening and reading tons of interesting and compelling content that's appropriate to your level. According to Krashen, the more that you're exposed to messages you understand in the target language, the more your brains will absorb those messages and acquire the language over time. You need to get the target language inside you through massive amounts of input before you can speak fluently. Obviously, this is a very short summary and doesn't capture all the intricacies and nuances and all the research that went into developing the input hypothesis. And if you actually really want to do a deep dive to find out a bit more, I've also included a link in the description to Krashen's website to kind of cover it in a bit more detail. Now, within the language learning community, as well as language education in general, Krashen's ideas have become really influential, as well as somewhat polarizing. Now, what do I mean by polarizing? Well, on one extreme, you have a few people who hang on to Krashen's every word and view him kind of like an Isaac Newton-like figure, someone who's discovered the undisputable laws of second language acquisition in the same way that Newton discovered the law of gravity. On the other extreme, there are people who argue Krashen's work has no value at all and that we should just stick to the traditional classroom language learning methods of rote memorization and grammar exercises. I strongly disagree with both of these extreme interpretations of the theory, and I think reality is probably a bit more complicated and nuanced. So first, let me say where I stand and agree with the input hypothesis. Krashen puts input in the front and center of language learning. In other words, the thing you should be spending most time doing is taking the language in some form of, whether that's a basic conversation with native speakers or listening to podcasts, TV shows. And I think this is such an important insight. Like I've mentioned before, when I was learning Spanish at school, I never really was told about this idea that, I should probably be going back home and listening to podcasts in Spanish, watching TV in Spanish. I never really understood this idea of comprehensible input. We were given traditional homework exercises like memorizing vocab lists, completing grammar quizzes, etc. But nobody advised me to listen to interesting Spanish podcasts, watch cool Spanish Netflix shows, or expose myself to language through conversations themselves. So I never got anywhere near enough of the language in me to be able to speak Spanish at anything like an acceptable level. Now, contrast that with when I started learning Chinese. I put comprehensible input at the center of my learning. As I mentioned in previous videos, I started with really simple and slow conversations with a really super patient Chinese friend, and there's some really basic YouTube videos for beginners before gradually progressing, and podcasts too, gradually progressing until I was able to understand content that was meant for native speakers. So in lockdown, I was exposed to hours and hours and hours of Chinese. Over the first 2 years, I probably clocked up hundreds of hours of exposure to the language. And there's no doubt that this was absolutely critical. And one of the main differences between my failure in Spanish and my success with Mandarin. So on this point, you could say I'm firmly in the input hypothesis camp. But as I mentioned earlier, I also disagree with some of the more extreme interpretations of the input hypothesis. Firstly, I don't agree with people who suggest comprehensible input is somehow the only thing we have to worry about, or it's like the cure for anything. We might say in Chinese, 包治百病, like it's going to solve all our problems. But I don't really think that's the case in language learning. So you often hear people who are Krashen followers online throwing around slogans like just immerse more, or you just need more input in response to any problem that might come up in language learning. Bad pronunciation, you just need more input. Poor sentence structure, just immerse more. And although Krashen himself has never explicitly said that comprehensible input is the cure for everything, It's not difficult to see how his followers might have interpreted this from some of the statements he's made. Consider this quote where Krashen discusses his experience learning Mandarin in an interview with polyglot Ollie Richards. When it comes to Mandarin, I sometimes go to the old classic thing where I want to make sure what I'm saying is absolutely correct. Is this tone number 2 or tone number 3? The cure for this is compelling input. The cure is an interesting story and interesting conversations. Then all that fades away. Now here I don't completely agree. My own experience of reaching a pretty high level in Mandarin, as well as observing learners I've coached on our masterclasses, has taught me that while input is certainly quite a big part of the picture, it's not the whole picture. Students who just sit in front of the TV and are watching Chinese cartoons all day are probably going to develop really good comprehension skills. But there are almost always crucial aspects of their spoken Chinese that are often lacking, maybe some wacky tones or some Chinglish sentence structures being the key giveaways. And related to this is another aspect of the input hypothesis that I'm not totally on board with, and that's Krashen's suggestion that speaking isn't practicing. Now, to be clear about what he means here, unlike many of his followers, Krashen has never said that you should delay speaking a foreign language, or that speaking too early will somehow harm your language learning. But he does seem to regard practice speaking as less important than input, especially at beginner and intermediate phases. Now, just so I don't misrepresent him on this, I'm just going to read a quote from a presentation that he did on the input hypothesis, which I'll also link to in the description. Speaking isn't practicing. If you want to improve your Spanish, it will not help you to speak Spanish out loud in the car as you drive to work in the morning. It will not help you to go to the bathroom, close the door, and speak Spanish to the mirror. I used to believe these things helped. Now I don't think they do. Now in this presentation, he's using Spanish as an example, but it's clear from the context he's making some generalized claims about acquiring second languages in general. And this directly contradicts my own experience. So in my opinion, speaking, and in particular speaking Chinese to myself, played a huge role in my language regime from really early on. And doing this enabled me to start thinking in the language, using sentence structures I've learned to construct new sentences and describe things around me in daily life, kind of creating my own immersion environment, which I wouldn't have otherwise had. But perhaps even more importantly, deliberate speaking practice has helped me train my muscle memory. It's widely recognized as one of the most challenging aspects of Chinese. That is, being to pronounce the sounds, especially the tones, accurately at natural speed. And there's just no getting around the fact this does require lots and lots of focus and deliberate practice to get right. And this is one of the most common questions I get when running our masterclass sessions on tones and sentence mining. It's how can I speak accurately and fluently at the same time? And the answer I always give is you have to practice speaking, lots and lots of speaking, preferably with plenty of feedback to develop a sort of feedback loop from native speakers. So you can see where you're going wrong, correct it, make sure you don't get it wrong the next time. So to conclude, my views on this is undeniable that the input hypothesis has made a great contribution to language education. The truth is, most learners underestimate the amount that they need to expose themselves to language in order to reach high levels of both comprehension and fluency. And I definitely recommend finding content you enjoy listening to or watching and setting aside to just immerse in the Chinese language. But equally, let's not go overboard. If your goal is to learn to speak Chinese fluently, and since you're watching this channel, there's a high chance that that is your goal, it's going to take more than just plonking yourself in front of the TV and watching content you enjoy for hours on end. It's going to require some deliberate practice. It's probably going to require some memorization and some other aspects, which I talk about in other videos. But I really want to hear what you guys think. I'm really interested in hearing your views about today's topic, whether you agree or disagree with my thoughts and what your thoughts are as well. So if you enjoyed today's video, I'd really appreciate it if you leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.